In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 different species have learned to coexist under the banner of the Galactic Defense Coalition, there exists a simple truth that every military commander knows by heart. Numbers don't lie. Combat statistics, kill ratios, mission success rates, these cold, hard facts determine promotions, assignments, and respect among the stars. So when a seemingly ordinary human recruit named Marcus Chen walked into the recruitment center on Kepler Station, nobody expected the galaxy's most advanced military database to crash 3 times trying to process his background check. Nobody expected the automated threat assessment system to flag him with a classification that hadn't been used in over 2 centuries, and certainly, nobody expected that this quiet man with calloused hands and tired eyes would force the Coalition's top brass to question everything they thought they knew about warfare, honor, and what it truly means to be human. The galaxy was about to learn that some humans don't just survive wars, they end them. And Marcus Chen was about to teach an entire civilization of warriors that there's a difference between being a soldier and being a weapon forged by necessity in the fires of a world that forgot mercy long before it reached for the stars. What happens when the most peaceful alliance in galactic history discovers that their newest recruit isn't just another human seeking adventure among the stars, but a walking reminder of what happens when humanity has no choice but to fight for its very survival? The recruitment center on Kepler Station hummed with its usual mixture of nervous energy and mechanical precision. Young beings from across the galaxy lined up in orderly queues, their various appendages clutching application tablets while holographic displays showcased the glory and honor of serving in the Galactic Defense Coalition. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the breathing requirements of dozens of different species, creating a symphony of soft whirs and gentle hisses that had become as familiar as a heartbeat to those who worked there. Sergeant Vaxtari adjusted her ceremonial sash for the 3rd time that morning, her forearms moving in practiced synchronization as she prepared for another day of processing eager recruits. As a Keteran, her species was known for their methodical nature and attention to detail, qualities that made them excellent administrators and terrible comedians. She had been running the Kepler Station Recruitment Center for 8 standard years, and in that time she had seen every type of hopeful warrior the galaxy had to offer. There were the young Valdorians with their crystalline skin that sparkled under the station's artificial lighting, dreaming of piloting the Coalition's newest starfighters. The burly Thraxans would lumber through her office, their rock-like hides scarred from ritual combat, seeking positions in the heavy assault divisions. Delicate whisper folk would flutter in on gossamer wings, their voices barely audible as they inquired about intelligence and reconnaissance roles. Each species brought their own strengths, their own dreams, and their own carefully documented limitations. The Coalition's military database was a marvel of technological achievement, capable of cross-referencing biological capabilities, psychological profiles, and combat potential across thousands of species within nanoseconds. It could predict with 97% accuracy whether a recruit would excel in space combat, ground assault, logistics, or command roles. The system had been refined over centuries of use, its algorithms fine-tuned by the greatest military minds in galactic history, which was why nobody was prepared for what happened when Marcus Chen walked through the reinforced doors that Tuesday morning. He was unremarkable by most standards, a human male of average height and build, somewhere in his early 30s by Terran reckoning. His brown hair was cut short and practical, showing the first hints of grey at the temples. His clothes were clean but well worn, the kind of garments that spoke of careful maintenance rather than frequent replacement. What struck Vextari most was his eyes. They held a weariness that seemed far too deep for someone his apparent age. "I'd like to enlist," he said simply, his voice carrying the flat inflection of someone who had learned to waste no words. Vextari's primary hands reached for a standard application tablet while her secondary hands continued organizing files. "Of course, citizen. Species designation and world of origin. Chapter. Terra." She paused, her dark eyes studying him more carefully. Humans were relatively new to the Coalition, having achieved interstellar flight only within the last century. They were considered moderately capable fighters, not as strong as Thraxans, not as quick as Valdorians, not as naturally armored as her own people. Pleasant enough beings, generally peaceful, with a curious tendency toward what they called emotional attachment to their squad mates. The database classified them as adequate support personnel with above-average adaptability. "Terra," she repeated, making a note on the tablet. "That's the human homeworld, correct? I understand it's quite peaceful now. Beautiful oceans and diverse ecosystems, according to the cultural exchange reports." Something flickered across Marcus's face. An expression too quick to interpret but somehow deeply unsettling. Something like that. Vextari handed him the tablet, her fingers briefly brushing against his. She was surprised by the calluses on his hands, not the soft calluses of someone who worked with tools or instruments, but the hard, specific calluses that came from gripping weapons for extended periods. She had felt similar calluses on the hands of career soldiers, beings who had spent decades in active combat zones. Please complete the standard questionnaire. The system will guide you through the process. Physical capabilities, education background, any previous military experience, that sort of thing. Marcus nodded and moved to one of the privacy booths that lined the far wall. Vextari watched him go, noting the way he walked. There was something predatory about his movement, a careful awareness of his surroundings that reminded her of the Coalition's most seasoned veterans. Yet according to his initial filing, Terra had been at peace for over 50 years. She turned her attention to other applicants, processing an enthusiastic Valdorian who wanted to follow in his grandfather's footsteps as a fighter pilot, and a nervous whisper folk who stammered through questions about cryptographic analysis roles. The morning progressed normally until her workstation began emitting a series of soft chimes. The first chime was routine. It meant Marcus had completed his basic questionnaire and the system was beginning its analysis. The second chime, 30 seconds later, indicated the database was cross-referencing his responses with Coalition military standards. The third chime was unusual. It suggested the system was requesting additional processing time for complex calculations. By the seventh chime, Vextari was frowning. By the 12th, she was actively worried. When her workstation began emitting a continuous tone and the holographic display flickered from blue to amber to red, she knew something was seriously wrong. System error, the pleasant synthetic voice announced. Unable to process application. Requesting supervisor intervention. Vextari's 4 hands moved across her console with practiced efficiency, pulling up diagnostic screens and error logs. What she saw made her mandibles click in confusion. The system hadn't crashed due to a software glitch or hardware failure. It had encountered data that fell so far outside normal parameters that it couldn't classify the applicant. She reviewed Marcus's responses, expecting to find some obvious error or joke entry that had confused the database. Instead, she found answers that were eerily straightforward and completely impossible. Previous military experience, extensive. Combat deployments, multiple. Confirmed enemy kills, aerial to deck specialist in search of the Dragon capital. Vextari stared at the screen, her mandibles clicking rapidly in the Keteran equivalent. Vextari stared at the screen, her mandibles clicking rapidly in the Keteran equivalent of nervous laughter. Humans were peaceful. Their homeworld was a garden paradise where the greatest conflict in recent memory had been a disagreement over trade regulations. The Coalition's cultural attachés had filed dozens of reports describing Terra's serene cities, artistic achievements, and commitment to diplomatic solutions. She activated her emergency communication link, sending a priority message to Commander Thorne, the station's senior officer. Within minutes, the grizzled Aldorian arrived at her desk, his scaled brow furrowed in concern. "What's the situation, Sergeant?" "Sir, I have a human applicant whose background check has crashed the system 3 times. The database is flagging him with threat assessments I've never seen before." Commander Thorne's yellow eyes narrowed as he studied the error messages. As a veteran of 12 different conflicts across the galaxy, he had seen his share of dangerous beings: pirates, mercenaries, war criminals. The recruitment center occasionally attracted individuals with questionable backgrounds, and the system was designed to flag them immediately. But this was different. The threat assessment wasn't suggesting Marcus Chen was dangerous because of criminal activity or psychological instability. It was suggesting he was dangerous because of his proven combat effectiveness. Combat effectiveness that shouldn't exist for someone from a peaceful world. "Have you spoken with the applicant?" "Briefly, sir. He seems normal enough. Quiet, polite. But there's something about him." She trailed off, unsure how to articulate her unease. Commander Thorne made a decision that would later be remembered as the moment everything changed. "Bring him to my office." "And, Sergeant, secure this data. Classification level, Alpha 7. Vextari's eyes widened. Alpha 7 classification was reserved for information that could affect galactic security. It was typically applied to intelligence about new weapons technologies or strategic enemy positions, not background checks for routine recruits. Marcus Chen was escorted to Commander Thorne's office with a level of ceremony that was both respectful and obviously security conscious. 2 guards flanked him, not restraining him, but clearly present. If Marcus noticed the unusual treatment, he gave no sign of it. The office itself was a study in military efficiency. Holographic displays showed tactical readouts from across Coalition space. Awards and commendations from a dozen different worlds lined the walls, testament to Commander Thorne's distinguished service record. A massive window provided a view of the station's docking bays, where ships from across the galaxy arrived and departed in carefully orchestrated patterns. "Please, sit," Commander Thorne said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I understand you're interested in joining the Coalition Defense Forces." "Yes, sir." "Our initial screening process has encountered some irregularities with your application. I'm hoping you can help us resolve them." Marcus nodded, his expression unchanged. "What kind of irregularities?" Commander Thorne activated a holographic display showing the error messages. "Our database is having difficulty processing your military background. According to our information, Terra has been at peace for decades. Yet your responses suggest extensive combat experience." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. He stared at the holographic display, his jaw working slightly as if he were choosing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made both officers unconsciously lean forward. "Commander, what do you know about Terra's history?" "The standard cultural reports. A peaceful world that achieved interstellar flight through scientific cooperation. Beautiful oceans, diverse ecosystems, a population committed to artistic and intellectual pursuits." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's Terra now. That's what we built after the wars ended." Commander Thorne felt a chill run down his scaled spine. "What wars?" "The resource wars lasted 47 years. The bioplay conflicts another 15. The final campaign," Marcus paused, his eyes growing distant. 3 years of hell that ended when there was nothing left worth fighting for except the right to exist." The office fell silent except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Commander Thorne found himself staring at this unremarkable human with growing comprehension and horror. "You're telling me that Terra was at war for over 60 years? More or less. Sometimes multiple wars at once. Different factions, different ideologies, different ways of killing each other." Marcus's voice remained flat, clinical. "The Coalition's cultural attachés visited Terra 15 years after the armistice. By then, we'd rebuilt most of the cities, restored the ecosystems, established the peaceful society they reported on. And you fought in these wars. It wasn't a question." Marcus nodded. "How old were you when they started?" 7. Commander Thorne closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him. A child soldier. A being who had known nothing but war for most of his life, who had somehow survived conflict so devastating that an entire planet had chosen to rebuild from scratch rather than remember them. "The database keeps requesting information about your confirmed kills," Commander Thorne said quietly. Marcus was quiet for so long that both officers began to wonder if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his words sent shockwaves through everything they thought they understood about warfare and the beings who waged it. "I stopped counting at 10,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Commander Thorne, a veteran of dozens of battles, had personally killed perhaps 3 dozen enemies in his entire career. Most Coalition soldiers went their entire service without taking a single life. 10,000 kills was beyond comprehension. It was the stuff of legends, of mythical warriors from primitive worlds where honor was measured in blood. But looking at Marcus Chen, seeing the weariness in his eyes, and the careful way he held himself, Commander Thorne realized he wasn't looking at a legend or a myth. He was looking at what humanity became when it had no choice but to fight for its survival. And now this human wanted to join the Coalition's military forces. The implications were staggering. Word traveled fast through the command structure of the Galactic Defense Coalition, but some news traveled faster than others. Within 6 hours of Marcus Chen's interview with Commander Thorne, encrypted communications were flashing across subspace networks to every major Coalition installation in the sector. By the end of the day, Admiral Kestara herself was boarding a priority transport from the Central Command Station to Kepler. The Admiral was a Zenthari, a species known for their towering height, silver-scaled skin, and absolute dedication to military precision. She had commanded fleets through the Outer Rim conflicts, negotiated peace treaties with hostile species, and personally led ground assaults when diplomacy failed. In her 60 years of service, she had seen every form of warfare the galaxy had to offer, from elegant space battles fought with mathematical precision to brutal ground conflicts where survival depended on instinct and determination. She had never encountered anything like the human sitting quietly in the station's secure briefing room. Marcus had been provided with temporary quarters and asked to remain available for additional interviews. He had agreed with the same quiet acceptance that seemed to characterize everything about him. No demands, no questions about his rights or legal representation, no protests about the unusual nature of his treatment. He simply waited, as if waiting was something he had learned to do exceptionally well. The briefing room was sterile and functional, designed to accommodate beings from a dozen different species without favoring any particular biology. Marcus sat at the central table, his hands folded in his lap, watching the stars wheel slowly past the room's single viewport. He didn't turn when the door opened and Admiral Kestara entered, followed by Commander Thorne and a small entourage of senior officers. "Mr. Chen," the Admiral said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "I am Admiral Kesathara, Commanding Officer of the 7th Fleet. I understand you wish to join our forces." "Yes, ma'am." She took the seat across from him, studying his face with the intensity that had made her famous among Coalition tactical analysts. She had read Commander Thorne's report, reviewed the fragmentary data the system had managed to process, and consulted with xenosociology experts about human psychology and culture. Nothing had prepared her for actually meeting him. "Before we discuss your potential service, I need to understand what we're dealing with. Commander Thorne's report suggests that Terra's history is significantly different from what our cultural attaches documented." Marcus nodded. They saw what we wanted them to see. A peaceful world recovering from minor conflicts, focused on art and science and building a better future. It wasn't exactly a lie. But it wasn't exactly the truth either. "No, ma'am. Admiral Kesthara activated a holographic recorder. For the official record, please state your full name and explain the discrepancy between our understanding of Terra's recent history and the reality you've described." Marcus straightened slightly, falling into a posture that spoke of countless military briefings. "Marcus Chen, formerly of the 47th Terra Defense Regiment, last rank held was Colonel. Terra was engaged in continuous warfare from the year 2387 to 2452, standard galactic calendar. The conflicts began as resource disputes between continental confederations and escalated into global warfare involving chemical weapons, biological agents, and eventually nuclear exchanges." The officers around the table exchanged glances. 65 years of continuous warfare was unprecedented in modern galactic history. Most conflicts lasted months, occasionally years. The idea of a planetary population sustaining warfare for over half a century was almost inconceivable. "What was the nature of these conflicts?" Admiral Kestara asked. "Initially, control of freshwater sources and mineral deposits. As resources became scarcer and populations more desperate, the wars evolved. Ideological conflicts, territorial expansion, revenge cycles. Toward the end, we were fighting because it was the only thing we remembered how to do." Marcus paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the viewport. "The bioplague wars were the worst. Engineered diseases that targeted specific genetic markers. We learned to fight in environmental suits because the air itself could kill you. Learned to trust no one completely because your allies today might be your enemies tomorrow, depending on which way the political winds blew." Commander Thorne leaned forward. "You said you stopped counting kills at 10,000. In what capacity were you serving?" "I started as a child soldier in the Continental Defense Forces. Learned to use a rifle before I learned to drive a ground vehicle. By the time I was 15, I was leading reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. By 20, I was running special operations units. By 30, I was commanding entire battle groups." The Admiral felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature controls. Child soldiers were considered a war crime by every civilized species in the galaxy. The idea that an entire world had descended so far into barbarism that children became warriors was deeply disturbing. "These special operations," she said carefully, "what did they involve?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if the words were physically difficult to produce. "Deep penetration raids, sabotage, assassination of high-value targets, recovery of coalition personnel from hostile territory." He paused. "War crimes by current galactic standards. Things we did because the alternative was extinction. Can you be more specific?" "Admiral, with respect, some things are better left unspecified." The room fell silent. Admiral Kesathara had seen her share of classified operations, had ordered strikes that resulted in significant casualties, had made decisions that haunted her quiet moments. But there was something in Marcus's voice that suggested depths of experience she couldn't fully comprehend. "The final campaign," she said, changing direction. "You mentioned 3 years of hell. What happened?" Marcus closed his eyes, and for the first time since the interview began, his carefully controlled composure cracked slightly. The remaining factions realized that if we continued fighting, there wouldn't be a Terra left to fight for. The environment was collapsing, the population had dropped by 70%, and the infrastructure was so damaged that basic survival was becoming impossible. He opened his eyes, and Admiral Kestara saw something there that made her instinctively lean back. So they made a decision. One final campaign to end all campaigns. Every surviving military unit, every remaining weapon, every last desperate strategy, everything thrown into 3 years of total warfare. The idea was that whoever survived would inherit what was left of the world. And you participated in this campaign? I led significant portions of it. The casual way he said it was somehow more chilling than if he had boasted or shown emotion. This human had commanded armies in a war that had nearly destroyed his entire species, and he spoke of it with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. How did it end? Exhaustion. Both sides ran out of people to fight and things to fight with. The last battle was fought with improvised weapons and soldiers who were barely old enough to walk. When it was over, the surviving commanders met on a battlefield littered with the dead and agreed that enough was enough. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the movement somehow making him seem older. We spent the next 15 years rebuilding. Not just the cities and infrastructure, but the entire concept of what it meant to be human. We created art, established universities, developed peaceful technologies. We worked very hard to become the species your cultural attachés met. Admiral Kestara found herself struggling with concepts that challenged her understanding of civilization itself. The coalition represented the pinnacle of interspecies cooperation, a society where conflicts were resolved through diplomacy and limited military action. The idea of a species fighting itself to near extinction and then successfully rebuilding as a peaceful civilization was unprecedented. Why did you leave Terra? She asked. Because I'm not part of that peaceful civilization, Marcus replied simply. I'm a relic from the old world, a reminder of things people prefer to forget. My presence makes them uncomfortable, and I understand why. So you came here to join the coalition military?
I came here because fighting is what I know how to do. It's what I'm good at.
And I've heard that the coalition occasionally faces threats that require more than diplomatic solutions. Admiral Kestara considered this. The coalition did indeed face threats. Pirates, rogue states, occasional hostile species that rejected diplomatic contact. But these conflicts were typically resolved through overwhelming technological superiority and precise military application. The idea of deploying someone with Marcus's background seemed both potentially valuable and deeply concerning. What makes you think you'd fit in with coalition forces? Commander Thorne asked. Our military philosophy emphasizes minimal casualties, precise objectives, and strict adherence to rules of engagement. Marcus almost smiled, the first expression other than careful neutrality that any of them had seen from him. Commander, I fought wars where the rules of engagement changed daily, where the definition of enemy shifted based on political alliances that lasted hours, and where success was measured by survival rather than strategic objectives. I think I can adapt to your more civilized approach to warfare. There was something in his tone. Not mockery exactly, but a kind of weariness that suggested he found their concerns almost quaint. Admiral Kestara realized that they were dealing with someone who had experienced warfare at a level that made their most brutal conflicts seem like training exercises. There would be psychological evaluations, she said. Extensive testing to ensure you could integrate with coalition forces without complications. I understand. And restrictions on your initial assignments. Observation and evaluation periods, probably starting with non-combat roles, until we better understand your capabilities and psychological profile. Yes, ma'am. His ready acceptance was almost more unsettling than resistance would have been. Admiral Kestara found herself wondering what kind of person emerged from decades of total warfare with their sanity intact, and whether that person could truly integrate into a civilization that had never known such extremes. Mr. Chen, she said finally, I'm going to be direct with you. Your background is unprecedented in coalition history. We have procedures for integrating veterans from various conflicts, protocols for dealing with trauma and psychological adjustment, but we've never encountered someone with your level of combat experience. I understand your concerns, Admiral, but I'm not asking for special treatment or consideration. I just want to serve. Why? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Why would someone who had already given decades of his life to warfare volunteer for more? Why would someone who had seen the ultimate consequences of violence choose to continue down that path? Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars that slowly wheeled past the viewport. When he finally spoke, his words carried a conviction that resonated through the sterile briefing room. Because peace is fragile, Admiral. Your coalition represents something beautiful. Dozens of species working together. Conflicts resolved through discussion rather than bloodshed. Exploration and discovery instead of conquest and destruction. But that peace exists because people are willing to fight for it when necessary. He turned to face her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not cruelty or bloodthirst, but a deep understanding of what peace truly cost. I can't create peace, Admiral. I don't know how to build the kind of civilization Terra became, or that the Coalition represents, but I know how to protect it, and sometimes that's just as important. Admiral Kestara sat in silence, weighing the implications of what she had heard. In her hands was perhaps the most dangerous individual the Coalition had ever encountered. Dangerous not because of malice or instability, but because of competence, born from necessity. The question was whether that danger could be channeled into protection for the peace they all valued. Outside the viewport, ships continued their graceful dance between the stars, carrying beings from dozens of worlds who had never known the kind of warfare that had forged Marcus Chen. The irony was not lost on her. The very peace that allowed such innocent movement might one day depend on someone who had been shaped by its absolute opposite. The decision she made in the next few minutes would echo across the galaxy in ways none of them could yet imagine. 6 months after Marcus Chen had first walked into the recruitment center on Kepler Station, the galaxy learned what humanity was truly capable of when the stakes were absolute. The lesson came in the form of a distress call from the agricultural world of Vidania Prime, where 20,000 Coalition citizens found themselves trapped between an advancing army of Korth raiders and the cold vacuum of space. Admiral Kestara had spent those 6 months carefully integrating Marcus into Coalition forces. He had undergone extensive psychological evaluation, completed accelerated training programs, and demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to adapt Coalition weapons and tactics to his own purposes. The psychologists had declared him remarkably stable for someone with his background, though they noted an emotional distance that suggested significant compartmentalization of traumatic experiences. His fellow soldiers had initially treated him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Word of his background had spread through unofficial channels, creating a legend that grew with each retelling. Some claimed he could kill an enemy at 1,000 meters with improvised weapons. Others whispered that he had personally ended entire wars single-handedly. The truth, as usual, was both simpler and more complex than the legends. Marcus had been assigned to the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, a unit that specialized in intelligence gathering and limited combat operations. His commanding officer, Major Veltar of the Altian Collective, had initially been skeptical about integrating such an experienced warrior into a unit of relative newcomers. That skepticism had gradually transformed into something approaching awe, as Marcus demonstrated tactical insights that came from decades of practical experience. The crisis on Vidania Prime began as a routine piracy incident. The Korth Confederation, a loose alliance of aggressive species from the galaxy's outer rim, had been conducting increasingly bold raids on Coalition worlds. Their tactics were brutal but predictable: overwhelm in force, rapid extraction of valuables, minimal engagement with military forces. The Coalition had responded with increased patrols and defensive installations, successfully deterring most raids. But the attack on Vidania Prime was different. Instead of hitting and running, the Korth had brought a massive fleet and what appeared to be a full invasion force. They had systematically destroyed the planet's orbital defenses, landed ground troops at strategic locations, and begun a methodical advance toward the capital city where most of the population had taken shelter. The Coalition's response fleet was 6 hours away, an eternity when measured against the Korth advance. The planet's hastily organized militia was brave but hopelessly outmatched. In desperation, the local commander had requested immediate assistance from any available Coalition units, no matter how small. The 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion had been conducting training exercises on a nearby moon when the distress call arrived. Major Veltar found herself faced with an impossible decision: ignore the call and wait for proper reinforcements, or attempt a rescue mission with 60 soldiers, against what intelligence suggested was a force of over 3,000 Korth warriors. The decision was made for her when Marcus Chen knocked on her office door and requested permission to speak privately. "Major," he said simply, "I know what you're thinking, and you're right. 60 soldiers can't fight 3,000 Korth in conventional warfare. Major Veltar studied the human across her desk. Over the past months, she had learned to trust his judgment on tactical matters, but what he seemed to be suggesting was tactical suicide. Then you understand why we can't respond to the distress call. I understand why we can't respond conventionally. Marcus activated the holographic display and brought up the tactical situation on Vidania Prime. But conventional warfare isn't the only option. He began highlighting specific locations on the planetary map: transportation hubs, communication centers, supply depots. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, identifying vulnerabilities that the official tactical assessment had missed. The Korth are following a standard invasion pattern. They've established a central command post here, positioned their heavy weapons at these locations, and are advancing along predictable routes toward the population centers. They're fighting the war they know how to fight. Major Veltar leaned forward, beginning to understand. And you're suggesting we fight a different war? I'm suggesting we fight the war they don't expect. Small unit tactics, disruption of command and control, elimination of key personnel, psychological warfare. Make them fight on our terms instead of theirs. Marcus, what you're describing sounds like the kind of warfare my people perfected over 60 years of continuous conflict. His voice was matter-of-fact. It is. And it works. Quote, the Major found herself staring at tactical projections that violated every principle of conventional military wisdom. Instead of meeting the enemy's strength with strength, Marcus was proposing to attack their weaknesses with precision. Instead of protecting territory, he was suggesting they deny the enemy the ability to hold territory. Instead of fighting to win battles, he was planning to make the entire concept of battle irrelevant. The casualties could be enormous, she said quietly. For the Korth, Marcus agreed. But Major, with respect, enormous casualties are what you're trying to prevent. 20,000 civilians are going to die if we don't act. Our choice is between certainly losing those lives and possibly saving them. Major Veltar closed her eyes, weighing decisions that would define her career and potentially her conscience for the rest of her life. When she opened them, Marcus was still waiting patiently, as if he understood that such decisions could not be rushed. What do you need? 12 volunteers. Small arms, demolition charges, and 6 hours to show them how to fight a war they've never seen before. The mission briefing that followed became legendary in Coalition military history, though the official records remained classified for decades. Marcus stood before 12 of the battalion's best soldiers, beings from 6 different species, all experienced in reconnaissance and light combat operations, and calmly explained how they were going to defeat an army that outnumbered them 250 to 1. Everything you've learned about honorable warfare, rules of engagement, and proportional response, he began. Forget it for the next 24 hours. We're not here to be honorable. We're here to save lives. Corporal Jimtai, a young Valdorian with crystalline features that sparkled under the briefing room lights, raised one of his 4 hands. Sir, are you suggesting we violate the Galactic Conventions on Warfare? Marcus considered the question seriously. Corporal, the Galactic Conventions exist to prevent unnecessary suffering and conflicts between civilized species. The Korth stopped being civilized the moment they began targeting civilian populations. We're going to use their barbarity against them. He activated the tactical display and began outlining the mission parameters. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of fighting the Korth army, they were going to dismantle it piece by piece. Communication centers would be destroyed, cutting off coordination between units. Supply depots would be eliminated, forcing the raiders to operate without resupply. Command personnel would be targeted, creating leadership vacuums that would paralyze decision-making. But sir, Sergeant Kaleth of the Thraxan Heavy Guard rumbled. This sounds like assassination and sabotage, not warfare. Sergeant, warfare is whatever proves effective at achieving your objectives while minimizing friendly casualties. The Korth have chosen to fight a war against civilians. We're going to show them what happens when they face someone who understands war better than they do. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from improvised explosive devices to psychological warfare techniques. Marcus demonstrated how to construct powerful bombs from materials commonly found in agricultural facilities, how to identify and exploit weaknesses in Korth command structures, and how to create the illusion of a much larger force through strategic deception. The most disturbing part for many of the volunteers was how matter-of-factly he discussed killing, not combat, not engagement with hostiles, but the specific techniques for ending lives quickly and quietly. He spoke of death with the clinical precision of a surgeon discussing procedure. and it gradually dawned on the assembled soldiers that they were receiving instruction from someone who had reduced killing to a science. "Questions?" Marcus asked as the briefing concluded. Lieutenant Fastenay, a whisperfolk whose gossamer wings trembled with nervous energy, spoke in her species' characteristic near whisper. "Colonel Chen, what you're proposing, it's not how the Coalition fights wars." "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. The Coalition fights wars between civilized beings who share common values about minimizing suffering and protecting innocence. What we're about to face isn't a war, it's an extermination attempt. And sometimes, stopping an extermination requires methods that civilization prefers to forget." The transport to Vidania Prime took 4 hours, during which Marcus continued his education of beings who had never imagined that warfare could be so personal and so ruthless. He taught them how to move silently through hostile territory, how to identify targets of maximum strategic value, and how to strike without warning or mercy. By the time they reached the agricultural world, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The Korth had overrun the outer settlements and were advancing on the capital with systematic efficiency. Intelligence reports suggested that civilians were being executed rather than captured, confirming Marcus's assessment that this was an extermination campaign rather than a conventional raid. The team inserted under cover of darkness at a location 20 kilometers behind Korth lines. Within an hour of touchdown, they had vanished into the countryside like ghosts, carrying with them the tools and knowledge to wage a war the raiders had never experienced. The first Korth command post simply disappeared. One moment it was coordinating the advance of 3,000 warriors, the next moment it was a crater in the ground, its personnel scattered in pieces across a 100-meter radius. The explosion was perfectly timed to coincide with a scheduled communication check, ensuring that the loss of contact would be attributed to equipment failure rather than enemy action. The second target was a supply depot that had been established to support the advancing ground forces. The guards never saw their attackers. They simply fell asleep at their posts and never woke up, victims of a poison gas that Marcus had synthesized from agricultural chemicals. When the depot exploded an hour later, the fireball could be seen from orbit. By dawn, the Korth advance had slowed to a crawl. Communication between units was sporadic at best. Supply lines were compromised, and command personnel were beginning to report sightings of large coalition forces that appeared and vanished like phantoms. What the raiders didn't realize was that they were seeing the same 12 soldiers repeatedly, using tactics that created the illusion of a much larger force. The psychological effect was devastating. The Korth were accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through superior numbers and firepower. They had no experience with an enemy that refused to present targets, that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Reports began filtering back to the main fleet describing encounters with supernatural warriors who could kill entire squads in seconds and disappear into the landscape. General Crexmore, commanding the Korth invasion force, found himself facing a situation that challenged everything he understood about warfare. His forces outnumbered the defenders by thousands to one, yet they were being systematically dismantled by an enemy he couldn't locate or engage. Worse, the reports from his field commanders were becoming increasingly incoherent, describing attacks that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Marcus Chen and his team were employing tactics that had been refined over decades of desperate warfare. Techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible for small unit operations. They moved faster than their enemies believed possible, struck with more precision than seemed humanly achievable, and disappeared more completely than physics should allow. But physics, Marcus had learned long ago, was less important than psychology in determining the outcome of battles. The end came not with a climactic battle, but with a whimper. On the second day of the operation, as coalition reinforcements finally arrived in the system, General Crexmore received a personal communication on a channel that should have been impossible for the defenders to access. The message was simple. A holographic projection of Marcus Chen, standing in what appeared to be the general's own command bunker, speaking in perfect Korth dialect. "General, your invasion has failed. Your command structure has been eliminated, your supply lines are compromised, and your forces are demoralized beyond recovery. You have two choices: withdraw immediately, and I'll allow your fleet to leave the system intact, or continue this pointless attack, and I'll show you why my species survived 60 years of total warfare." The projection ended, but the implications were clear. Somehow, impossibly, the enemy had infiltrated his most secure facility and delivered a message that demonstrated complete intelligence penetration of his forces. General Crexmore was a veteran of dozens of successful raids, a warrior who had earned his position through cunning and ruthlessness. He was also intelligent enough to recognize when he had encountered something beyond his experience. The withdrawal order went out within the hour. As the Korth fleet departed, leaving behind their ground forces in a desperate retreat that cost them nearly half their personnel, Admiral Kesthara stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the evacuation of Verdania Prime. In 60 hours, 12 coalition soldiers had defeated an army of 3,000 raiders without suffering a single casualty. The official report would credit superior tactics and intelligence gathering. The classified addendum would note that the operation had been conducted under the direct supervision of Colonel Marcus Chen, whose methods had proved devastatingly effective against conventional military forces. But the real lesson, the one that would reshape coalition military doctrine for generations to come, was written in the psychological profiles of the Korth prisoners. These hardened raiders, veterans of countless brutal campaigns, spoke of their attackers in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or supernatural phenomena. They had not been defeated by superior soldiers, they had been hunted by something that transcended their understanding of warfare. Marcus Chen returned to Kepler Station quietly, filing his report with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. When asked by Admiral Kesthara to explain how 12 soldiers had achieved what should have required thousands, he gave an answer that would become part of coalition military legend. Admiral, the galaxy has been fortunate to develop a civilization where warfare is conducted according to rules and conventions that minimize suffering. But those rules only work when both sides agree to follow them. When you encounter an enemy that recognizes no limits, your only choice is to demonstrate that some limits shouldn't be crossed. He paused, looking out at the stars that now seemed a little safer than they had been a week earlier. Sometimes, peace is preserved not by those who fight honorably, but by those who remember what happens when honor fails. The galaxy had learned that humans were more than just another species seeking their place among the stars. They were the children of a world that had tested the ultimate limits of warfare and emerged with both the wisdom to choose peace and the knowledge to defend it when necessary. And sometimes, that knowledge made all the difference between civilization and chaos.